Welcome, dwellers of the dark, to Nocturnal Nightmares TV. We are taught to fear the winter, the long nights, the biting cold, the world asleep under a blanket of white. But there is a different kind of horror that thrives in the opposite season, a terror that festers in the oppressive heat, that hides in the blinding sunlight, and whispers in the drone of insects. Summer is a time of light, but some things that live are not meant to be seen. Tonight, we bring you 5 harrowing accounts from a season of dread. These are not just stories. They are scars left behind by a summer of horrifying terror and nightmarish encounters. So lower the lights and listen close. The heat is rising. The first bottle I found wasn't sinister. It was beautiful. I was spending that summer working for the county, a glorified beachcomber, tasked with clearing trash from a remote 3-mile stretch of coastline in northern Oregon. It was a lonely job, just me, the shrieking gulls, and the endless, sighing gray of the Pacific. Most days I found plastic bags and fishing nets, but this bottle was different. It was thick, hand-blown glass, warped and iridescent, with no seams. It was sealed with a plug of dark, waxy material, and something was inside. Not a message in a bottle, but a single, perfectly preserved gray feather, suspended in the clear liquid within. I took it back to my small rental cabin, a strange and lovely curiosity. The next day, I found another. Same strange glass, same waxy seal. This one held a lock of brilliant blonde hair. The day after, a child's milk tube. A week passed, and my collection grew. A bottle with a shard of a blue seashell, one with a button from a sailor's peacoat, another with a dried, pressed pansy. Each was a tiny, perfect diorama of something lost. I arranged them on the windowsill of my cabin, a row of melancholic jewels against the gray sky. My summer job had become a treasure hunt, and I was obsessed. It was an old fisherman named Silas who gave the phenomenon a name. He saw my growing collection one afternoon when he stopped by to sell me some fresh crab. His face, a roadmap of sun and sea salt wrinkles, went pale. The glass tied, he rasped, his eyes fixed on the bottles. "You gotta stop, son. You gotta throw 'em back." I asked him what he meant. He told me an old story, a local legend I'd never heard. He said that sometimes, when the ocean feels a great loss or shipwreck, a swimmer pulled under by the riptide it grieves, and its grief takes form. It crystallizes around the last remnants of what it lost, sealing them in glass tombs born from sand and pressure. "They ain't messages," he warned, his voice low. "They're pieces, and they want to be whole again. You keep bringing M together, you're just helping it build itself a new body." I laughed it off as drunken Sishanti folklore, but his words planted a seed of unease. That night, I was woken by a sound, a low, resonant hum, like a tuning fork coming from the windowsill. I sat up in bed. The bottles were vibrating, each one emitting a faint, sorrowful note. The feather, the hair, the tooth, they all seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. The air in the cabin grew cold, tasting of salt and ozone. Silas's warning echoed in my mind. They want to be whole again. Still, I couldn't stop. The pull was too strong. The hunt was my entire world. My walks became frantic, desperate searches. I neglected to eat. I stopped answering calls from my family. All that mattered were the bottles. I found dozens, a silver locket, a single rusted key, a scrap of a love letter, the ink blurred into an illegible tear stain. My cabin was filled with them, the humming, a constant, maddening chorus that vibrated in my bones. I was getting headaches, a constant, dull pressure behind my eyes, as if I was sinking into the crushing depths of the sea. The final piece came to me in a dream. I dreamt of a cave, hidden by the high tide, and in it a bottle larger than the rest, glowing with a soft, milky light. I awoke in a cold sweat. The location burned into my mind. I didn't question it. I ran from the cabin, stumbling down the beach in the pre-dawn gloom. I found the cave exactly where I'd dreamt, and inside, nestled on a bed of kelp, was the bottle. It was the size of a human heart, and inside swirled a thick, pearlescent mist, the heart of the tide. I knew with a certainty that terrified and thrilled me that this was the last piece, the keystone. I carried it back to my cabin, my hands trembling. The humming from the other bottles intensified as I entered, rising to a fever pitch. They were calling to it. I cleared a space on the floor and began arranging them, not in a line, but in a shape, a form. It was instinct, a design whispered into my mind by the ceaseless hum. Arms, legs, a torso, a head, a humanoid shape made of glass and grief. All that was missing was the center. With a deep, shuddering breath, I placed the heart bottle in the chest cavity of the shape. The moment it touched the floor, the humming stopped. A profound, deafening silence filled the room. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a soft, wet, cracking sound. A single bottle fractured. Then another and another. The glass didn't shatter. It seemed to dissolve, melting into a viscous, shimmering liquid. The feather, the tooth, the lock of hair, they all dissolved with it, their essence merging into a single pearlescent pool on my floor. The pool began to rise. Pull it coalesced, pulling itself upwards, defying gravity. It formed a vaguely humanoid shape, a tall, shimmering figure made of liquid grief and captured memory. It had no face, only a smooth, swirling surface that reflected my own terrified expression. I saw the pansy bloom and die on its chest. I saw the glint of the locket swirl in its hand. The scent of salt and deep-sea decay filled my lungs. It took a single, silent step towards me. I was paralyzed, not by fear, but by a sudden, overwhelming wave of sorrow that was not my own. The creature, the gestalt entity born of 100 lost things, raised a shimmering, liquid hand. It wasn't reaching for me. It was reaching through me. I felt a coldness spread from my chest, a feeling of being hollowed out, filled with seawater. I looked down. My own body was becoming translucent, shimmering with that same pearlescent light. My collection on the windowsill. I had thought I was the collector, but the truth was far more horrifying. It had been collecting pieces all summer, using me as its hands. And now, its collection was finally complete. That summer, I took a job with a small construction crew to make some quick cash before the fall semester. Our project was a single, modern house being built on a remote plot of land in the Virginia foothills, a place called Angleton Point. Architect was some eccentric out-of-towner, and the blueprints were weird. The lead foreman, a gruff man named Dale, was constantly cursing under his breath about them. "Angles are all wrong," he'd mutter. "Nothing's square. It's like the guy who drew this never heard of a right angle." The foundation was a simple concrete slab poured over a patch of earth that had been scraped clean. But from the first day we started framing the walls, things felt off. The air on the property was heavy, strangely silent. Birds seemed to avoid flying overhead, and Dale was right. The house was a geometric nightmare. Walls met at 88 degrees or 92 degrees. Hallways seemed to subtly narrow as you walked down them. Standing in the half-finished living room gave you a strange, dizzying sense of vertigo, like your equilibrium was being gently but persistently twisted. We all felt it. Tools would disappear from where we'd left them, only to reappear on the other side of the site. We'd hear whispers on the wind that sounded like tape recordings played backwards. One of the guys, a young kid named Kevin, quit after the first week. He said he saw a woman in a white dress standing in the spot where the master bedroom would be. But when he blinked, she was gone. Dale just grunted and told him the heat was getting to him. My job was mostly drywall, hanging and mudding. The endless off-kilter walls. I spent hours alone inside the skeletal structure. The vertigo grew worse. Sometimes I'd look up from my work and the layout of the house would seem to have changed. A doorway would be where a window was supposed to be. A hallway would seem longer, stretching into impossible, shadowy distances. Blink, shake my head, and it would be normal again. I told myself it was exhaustion, the disorienting effect of the strange angles. The true horror began when we installed the doors. Dale had a specific set of instructions from the architect. Each interior door had to be fitted with a heavy, complex series of locks. Not just a deadbolt, but slide bolts at the top and bottom, and even an old-fashioned hook-and-eye lock. Why would you put 6 locks on a pantry door? I asked Dale, holding up one of the heavy oak doors. He just shrugged, not meeting my eyes. Client's a paranoid rich guy. Just do what the plans say. One evening, I was working late, finishing up a section by myself. The sun had set. The interior of the house was a maze of deep shadows. I was in what was meant to be a child's bedroom, fitting the last of the slide bolts to the door. As I worked, I heard a sound from the other end of the house. A soft, rhythmic tapping, dot, tap, 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 dot. I froze, listening. It was coming from the master bedroom. I called out, "Dale, you still here?" The tapping stopped. Silence. I shook my head, my heart pounding. It was just the house settling. the wood creaking. I went back to work. A few minutes later, the tapping started again, but this time it was closer, coming from the hallway just outside the room I was in. Tap, 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 tap. It was the sound of a single fingernail, methodically tapping against a wooden doorframe. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. I wasn't alone. I slowly peered out into the hall. It was empty. The sound had stopped the instant I looked. I grabbed my tools and decided to call it a night. I walked down the long, slightly too narrow hallway towards the front entrance. As I passed the closed door to the master bedroom, I heard a whisper. From inside, a woman's voice, frail and terrified. "Don't leave me in here with it." I stopped dead, my blood turning to ice. It was the voice of the woman Kevin had described. I stood there, trembling, for a full minute. Then I heard another sound from inside the room. A low, wet, guttural chuckle. It wasn't human. I ran. I didn't even bother closing up. I sprinted out of the house, jumped in my truck, and sped away. I called Dale and told him I quit. He didn't sound surprised. He just said, "Yeah, I figured." I drove past the site a month later, out of morbid curiosity. The house was finished. It looked beautiful from the outside, a masterpiece of modern architecture. A family was moving in, a man, a woman, and their 2 small children. They were laughing, carrying boxes through the front door. The sight made me physically ill. It was only then that I finally understood. The blueprints weren't for a house. They were for a cage. The strange, non-Euclidean angles weren't a design choice. They were meant to confuse and disorient whatever was trapped inside. The 6 locks on every door weren't to keep intruders out. They were to keep the residents in. The architect hadn't built a home. He had built a trap, a lure, a sacrificial offering. The woman in white wasn't the threat. She was the first victim, a spirit permanently snared within its impossible geometry. And that family, they weren't the owners. They were the bait. They were the fresh food being delivered to the monster that was already locked inside, waiting patiently in the master bedroom. The house wasn't being haunted. The house was the haunting. The summer fair that rolled into our county every July was a tapestry of faded glory, rusting rides, rigged carnival games, and the cloying smell of fried dough and diesel fumes. For a teenager like me, it was the highlight of an otherwise suffocatingly dull summer. My friends and I would spend our evenings there, wasting our money and chasing cheap thrills. This year, there was a new attraction, tucked away between the Tilt-A-Whirl and a dilapidated funhouse. Professor Marvel's Museum of Unnatural Wonders. The tent was dark and smelled of canvas and formaldehyde. Inside were the usual gaffs, a jackalope, a jar supposedly containing a captured poltergeist, a shrunken head from deepest Borneo, but in the center of the tent, on a velvet-draped pedestal, was the main attraction, the Stillman. The sign claimed he was a lost explorer from the 1920s, perfectly preserved by a freak volcanic event. He was unnervingly lifelike. He stood in a slightly stooped posture, one hand outstretched as if reaching for something. He was dressed in khaki explorer's gear, and his skin had the texture of old, cracked leather. But it was his eyes that held you. They were wide, blue, and glassy, fixed in an expression of profound, unending surprise. He didn't look like a wax figure. He looked like a man who had been flash-frozen in a moment of pure terror. Professor Marvel, a portly man with a waxed mustache, would give his spiel about the Stillman's discovery. Most people would look, shudder, and move on. But I was captivated. I kept coming back night after night, staring at the figure. I started noticing things. The tiny wrinkles around his terrified eyes, the way his knuckles were white, gripping, an invisible support. The dust motes in the air never seemed to settle on him. One night, I was the last person in the tent. Professor Marvel was outside, hawking his attraction. I was alone with the Stillman. I took a step closer, my heart thudding. On a whim, I reached out and touched his outstretched hand. His skin wasn't cold and waxy. It was cool, yes, but it felt pliable, like human skin. I snatched my hand back as if burned. That's when I saw it. I blinked, and for a fraction of a second, his posture had changed. His hand was no longer outstretched. It was slightly lower, his fingers curled into a loose fist. I stared, my mind reeling. It had to be a trick of the light, my imagination. I stood there, unmoving, for a full minute, my eyes locked on him. He remained perfectly still. I finally convinced myself I was losing my mind and left the tent, shaken. The next night, I went back, armed with my phone. I stood in front of the pedestal and pretended to be texting, but I was secretly recording a video. I stayed for 10 minutes, not taking my eyes off him. He didn't move. Disappointed, I left. It was only when I got home and watched the video that the true horror revealed itself. On the video, as I stood there staring at him, he was moving, not a lot, just infinitesimal slow-motion adjustments. His head turned a single, barely perceptible degree towards me. His fingers slowly uncurled. He was moving only when he thought I wasn't truly looking, when my attention was divided by the phone. He was a predator that fed on inattention. I became obsessed. I spent every night at the fair, watching him, trying to catch him. I noticed that Professor Marvel looked drained, paler and thinner each day, with dark circles under his eyes. He seemed to spend all his time near the Stillman, as if tethered to it. The final night of the fair, a massive thunderstorm rolled in, scaring away the crowds. I found Professor Marvel frantically packing up his tent in the rain. He looked terrified. "You've seen it, haven't you, boy?" he asked, his voice a ragged whisper. "I've seen you watching. You know he's not a fake." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. "I won him in a card game in Marrakesh," he confessed, rain plastering his hair to his skull. "Thought he was just a clever statue, but he's not. He's a prison, and he's a parasite. He doesn't eat food. He eats time, life. The closer you are, the faster you age, the quicker you wither. He feeds on your future. He gestured to his own gaunt face. I've lost 20 years this summer alone, but I can't get away. He holds you. Suddenly, the generator for the faire sputtered and died, plunging us into darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning. A new, terrifying thought hit me. What happens when no one is looking at him at all? I asked. The professor's face went white with terror. He's fast, he whimpered, when no one sees him. He's so very fast. A flash of lightning illuminated the tent. The pedestal was empty. My heart stopped. Another flash. A leather balm was wrapped around Professor Marvel's throat from behind. The still man was behind him, no longer stooped, but standing tall and straight. His face, no longer frozen in surprise, was twisted into a grotesque, triumphant grin. His glassy eyes were fixed on me, and they were no longer blue. They were swirling with a hungry, ancient light. He moved in the split second of darkness between lightning flashes. With the next flash, he was standing in front of me, his grip tight on the now lifeless professor. His other hand, the one that had been outstretched all summer, shot out and grabbed my wrist. His touch was like 1,000 years of winter, a cold that leached the strength from my bones, the color from my world. I screamed and ripped my arm away. I ran blindly through the muddy, abandoned fairgrounds, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until the flashing lights of the midway were gone. I never found out what happened to the still man or the body of Professor Marvel. The attraction was just gone the next day. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a room and I blink, I feel it. A sudden, inexplicable chill. A feeling that, for the fraction of a second, I wasn't looking. The shadows in the room shifted, drew closer. I know he's out there, a new professor in tow, moving from town to town. A patient predator, hiding in plain sight, feeding on our diverted attention, one stolen second at a time. That summer, the heat was a living entity. A biblical, oppressive heatwave settled over our small desert town in Southern California. And for weeks, the temperature refused to dip below 110. The air was thick, syrupy, and the world was viewed through a constant, wavering shimmer rising from the asphalt. It was the shimmer that was the first sign. At first, it was just heat haze, a natural phenomenon. But then I started seeing things within it, not hallucinations, distortions. I'd be looking down my street, and for a split second, shimmer would coalesce, and I'd see my neighbor's house, but the roof would be caved in, the windows dark and broken. I'd blink, and it would be normal again. I saw cars on the highway suddenly appear rusted and ancient in the haze, their drivers skeletal figures before snapping back to reality. Glimpses of a rotted, decayed version of our world, visible only through the shimmering curtain of heat. I tried to tell my parents, but they brushed it off as heat stroke. Stay inside, drink water was their mantra. But I knew it was more than that. I started watching the shimmer obsessively. It seemed to be a veil, a thin spot between our world and somewhere else, a place where things had fallen into, ruined dot. And then I saw the man. He appeared only in the most intense shimmers, usually at high noon when the heat was at its peak. He was a tall, wavering figure, his form distorted by the heat like a reflection in a disturbed pond. He looked like a normal man in a business suit, but his movements were jerky and wrong, and he was always looking directly at me, no matter where I saw him shimmering over the roof of the school. In the middle of a blazing hot intersection, across the scorching sand of the playground, his distorted face was turned towards my house, towards me. The fear was a slow, creeping thing. He never did anything. He just appeared, a silent, wavering sentinel in the heat. I started to feel like I was being watched, not just by him, but by the shimmer itself. The heat was no longer just a weather condition. It was a presence. I started documenting it. I took photos, but the figure never showed up. It was only visible to the naked eye. I tried to film it, but on the screen, it was just heat haze. It was a phenomenon that existed only in the direct perception of reality, a ghost in the physics. Thrall of light. My dog, Buster, a golden retriever who usually loved the sun, refused to go outside. He would stand at the glass of the back door, whining, his fur bristling, staring at a patch of empty, shimmering air in the backyard. The climax came during the peak of the heat wave. The power grid had failed, and our house was an oven. My parents had gone to a town-run cooling center, but I'd refused, too afraid to leave, too afraid to go out into the shimmer. I sat in our darkened living room, sweating, staring out the front window at the wavering, empty street. And then I saw him. He wasn't in the distance. He was standing on our front lawn. The shimmer around him was so intense that the world behind him seemed to melt and warp. He was clearer now. His suit was frayed, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes two dark, hollow pits. He wasn't just a distortion anymore. He was crossing over. I scrambled away from the window, my heart hammering. I hid in the pantry, the darkest, coolest place in the house, my hands over my ears, praying. I heard the front door creak open, not forced, just open. Footsteps echoed in the silent house. They were slow, dragging, and wet like boots sloshing through mud. Even though the air was bone dry, the footsteps stopped right outside the pantry door. The air grew frigid, a pocket of impossible cold in the suffocating heat. The doorknob began to jiggle. A voice whispered from the other side. It was a sound like dry sand and broken glass. I know you can see me. It was the first time it had communicated. The voice wasn't just in the air. It was in my head, a cold, direct transmission. The heat makes the veil thin. We can see you, too, all of you. We've been watching for a long time, waiting for it to get hot enough. I held my breath, tears streaming down my face. Your world is so loud, so bright, so full of warmth. We want it. The doorknob stopped jiggling. A profound silence fell. Then a new sound. A soft, sizzling hiss, like water hitting a hot pan, coming from the wood of the door itself. A dark, wet stain began to spread from the keyhole. The wood around it started to smoke and blacken, decaying at a rapid rate. The shimmer wasn't just a window anymore. It was a solvent. It was a disease that rotted reality. I don't know how long I stayed in that pantry. Hours, maybe. When I finally found the courage to emerge, the house was empty. The front door was closed. The wet footsteps had evaporated. But on the pantry door, there was a perfect hand-shaped patch of rotted, blackened wood, cold to the touch. The heat wave broke a few days later, and the shimmer receded. Things went back to normal, but I know what I saw. I know what's waiting behind the other side of the heat. They aren't ghosts or demons. They're a race of sentient decay, living in a dead, cold world. And they're looking through the veil at us, waiting for the world to get warmer. Every summer, as the temperature climbs, I watch the air begin to waver, and I feel a cold, familiar dread, because I know the shimmer is coming back, and each year the veil gets a little bit thinner. My family moved to rural Ohio the summer the cicadas came. Not just any cicadas. This was the year of Brood X, the 17-year emergence, and our new house, an old farmhouse surrounded by ancient oak trees, was at the epicenter. From the moment we arrived, the air was vibrating with their song, a deafening, unified alien drone that never, ever stopped. It was the sound of summer, they said. To me, it was the sound of madness. The drone was inescapable. It seeped through closed windows, vibrated through the floorboards, and settled deep in your teeth. At night, I'd lie in bed and feel the rhythm of it in my own pulse. The locals thought it was a charming quirk of nature. They had cicada festivals, sold t-shirts. They were used to it. I was not after the first week. I started noticing patterns in the noise. It wasn't just a monotonous drone. There were subtle shifts in pitch, rhythmic pulses, moments of near silence, followed by a deafening crescendo. It was complex. It felt intentional. I mentioned this to our neighbor, an old farmer named Mr. Gable. He just laughed. Son, you listen to anything long enough, you'll start to hear a song. But it was a song. I started trying to decipher it. I downloaded a frequency analysis app on my phone and spent hours recording the cicadas, staring at the shifting sine waves on the screen. There were repeating sequences, call and response patterns between different sections of the woods. It was a language, a slow, patient, 17-year conversation. As June bled into July, the song began to change. It became more urgent, more complex, and I started to have nightmares. I dreamt I was deep underground, buried in the warm earth, surrounded by millions of sleeping things. I could feel their collective consciousness, a single ancient mind, dreaming a long, slow dream. And in the dream, they were receiving a signal, a song from the surface, telling them it was almost time to wake. Not for mating, but for something else. Something they called the harvest. I woke up from these dreams with the cicada drone pounding in my head, my ears ringing with phantom melodies. I started to understand, not the words, but the intent. The song wasn't just a conversation. It was a command. It was a broadcast, a massive biological signal being sent to something else. Something that had been sleeping under our town for a very long time. I tried to tell my parents I thought that cicadas were dangerous. They thought I was having a breakdown, a reaction to the stress of the move. They scheduled a therapist, but I knew I wasn't crazy. I went back to Mr. Gable. I showed him my recordings, my charts, the repeating patterns. He wasn't laughing this time. He looked at my data, then out at the vibrating trees, his face pale. "My grandpappy," he said, his voice a low tremor. He was here for the emergence in '53. He said something was different that year. Said the song was hungry. People went missing. Livestock vanished. They found strange tunnels in the fields, wide as a man, spiraling deep into the earth. When the cicadas died off, it all stopped. They hushed it up. A cold dread coiled in my stomach. The harvest. The final phase of the song began in early August. It was a single, high-pitched, piercing note that seemed to vibrate at the exact frequency of human bone. It was a key, turning a lock deep within the earth. That night, the ground in our backyard began to shift. The next morning, there was a hole near the old well, a perfectly round, dark tunnel leading straight down. My parents were horrified, calling the county, thinking it was a sinkhole. But I knew, Mr. Gable knew. He came over with a shotgun, his face grim. "It's starting," he said. That night, the cicada song stopped. For the first time all summer, there was absolute, terrifying silence. The silence lasted for exactly 1 hour. Then a new sound began. A wet, chittering, clicking sound, coming from the hole in the yard. And then from another hole that had opened in Gable's field. And another down the road. They were emerging. Not the cicadas. The things the cicadas had been calling. They were pale, multi-limbed creatures, the size of large dogs, with smooth white carapaces and clusters of black, unblinking eyes. They moved with a horrifying, insectile speed. They were the sleepers, the harvesters. We locked ourselves in the house, but they were relentless. They swarmed the walls, their sharp claws scratching at the windows, their chittering filling the night. They were testing for weaknesses, guided by some unseen intelligence. I looked out the window and saw Mr. Gable standing on his porch, firing Pierre's shotgun into the swarming mass. A dozen fell, but 100 more took their place. He was overwhelmed in seconds. The creatures finally broke through our basement window. My last memory is of my father holding a kitchen knife, standing between us and a tide of pale, chittering things pouring from the darkness. I am the only one left. I am hiding, writing this. I don't know why they left me. Perhaps the song has ended, and they are returning to their 17-year sleep, their bellies full. The world outside is silent now. The sun is rising. But I know that the cicadas laid their eggs. I know the cycle will begin again. Their children will burrow into the earth and begin their long, slow conversation, singing their lullaby to the horrors that sleep below. the world will forget. They'll call it a charming quirk of nature, but I will remember. I will spend the next 17 years waiting for the song to start again. The sun has set on our summer of terror, but the stories linger, don't they? A chilling reminder that the world is far older and stranger than we can imagine, and that some doors, once open, can never be closed again. The heat may fade, the nights may grow longer, but the memories of these encounters will remain a cold spot in the warm heart of the season. Thank you for joining us at Nocturnal Nightmares TV. If you value the darkness and the tales that are born from it, subscribe and enable notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next. Until then, sleep well and listen closely to the sounds of summer. You never know what might be listening back.